It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Acer XV282K KV. As usual, this video accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that what you see on the video is not an accurate representation of what you'd see on the monitor firsthand, and that's because what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on. Whilst I like to focus on mainly in-game examples in my reviews, the reason I do that is just because they're kind of more interesting to look at, and they give some nice examples of pretty scenes which can test out the monitors if you like. But what I'm showing you here with respect to contrast, colour reproduction, that kind of thing, they definitely apply more broadly than just games. I just use them as examples. So this monitor features a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution, supports a 144Hz refresh rate, and has a 28-inch screen. It also has various other attractive features such as HDMI 2.1 and a sensor suite which Acer calls Vision Care 3.0, and you can actually see the sensor there, it's flashing there. That's an infrared light, so you can't see that to the eye, you don't notice that at all to the eye, but the camera does pick that up. But these features are actually explored in the OSD video, which is a separate video accompanying this one. So the 4K UHD resolution on a 28-inch screen size, we've actually got an article on the website exploring that specific combination in quite a bit of detail actually, giving various examples, giving subjective analysis, and really I think it works quite nicely. I know some people prefer larger screens at this resolution, and that's fair enough, but I don't agree with people who say it's pointless having this resolution on a screen of this size. It certainly isn't. You can see plenty of benefits there. So the pixel density is excellent. That gives you a really nice detailed look to suitably high resolution image content. That would include 4K movie content, it would include games, certainly does include games, and high resolution images on the web or that you might be creating yourself as well. It also gives a very nice crisp and clear look to text. The clarity is very good there. And you will notice that everything looks very small, and that's because I'm not using any scaling. I've actually managed to use this monitor and others of this kind of size, even 27-inch 4K UHD models, without any scaling from my preferred viewing distance, which is about 70 centimeters, sometimes a little bit further than that actually. It still did take some getting used to because everything does look so small. But if you do want to use scaling, and many people will want to use scaling, the good news is that it is handled well by newer versions of Windows, and many applications as well. They're updated because high resolutions are becoming more popular. So if you use application-specific zoom, which means you zoom in the application, or if you're using scaling, which has the same effect, but it's done on sort of a broader level, really, then you still retain that excellent crisp look to text. Yes, everything's larger, but the pixel density itself is still important. But the level of desktop real estate, if you're using a relatively low level of scaling or no scaling as I am now, is really, really good for multitasking. I mean, you can see how much content you have there. It's all crisp, all sharp, all readable. Very useful. In the 4K UHD experience section of the written review, there are also some quite nice images comparing 100% or no scaling to 125% scaling, which is quite a low level of scaling. So certainly would recommend checking that out if you're interested in the difference between these two levels. And in the 4K UHD experience article, there are some examples of other scaling settings as well. Another thing which I think is worth slotting in here is the fact that this monitor is Eyesafe certified, so that means it uses patented technology by US company Eyesafe. And basically what this does, I mean, it's explored a bit in the written review. If you look at the end of the calibration section, this gives quite a nice summary and a few links related to this. But essentially what it does is it shifts the peak of blue light from the monitor to less energetic wavelengths. It also reduces the amplitude of the peak, and what that means is that you have less of this high energy blue light emitted from the monitor bombarding you. So you can actually think of this as a sort of always on low blue light setting, but unlike traditional low blue light settings, it doesn't affect the colour reproduction in the same way, so you don't get a clear warm look to things where there shouldn't be one, or a sort of greenish yellow tint as you sometimes get, that kind of thing. It's none of that, so you get the same kind of colour reproduction you'd expect to get, whilst also getting that reduction in energetic blue light. For some users who are particularly sensitive to this, Some monitor backlights, they just don't get on with them, and one of the reasons for that can be the amount of this higher energy blue light that they produce. So in terms of viewing comfort, there are many things to consider, but this is certainly one of them. This is certainly one big box ticked. This monitor also ticks various other boxes for viewing comfort. For example, it has a flicker-free backlight, and it can go nice and dim as well, quite dim, dimmer than some models would go. But there's an article exploring viewing comfort and all the factors to consider there on the website as well. There are many of them and it's different for each person. It's a very individual thing. But it is nice to have this Eyesafe certification and that box ticked. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has quite a homely look, really quite a simple design. The bottom bezel is matte black plastic. There is a printed silver Acer logo on the left side, so it's not shiny or anything like that. There's a central sensor area, and those sensors are explored in the OSD video. I talk a little bit about them in the written review as well. They control the iCare 3 functionality of the monitor, or the iCare 3.0 functionality if you prefer. And that includes a proxy sense, proximity sensor, color sense feature, which adjusts the color temperature based on ambient lighting, and a light sense feature, which changes the brightness of the monitor based on ambient lighting. The stand base is also matte black plastic. The neck there, that's actually powder coated metal, so it has a bit more of a premium feel to it, if you like. But actually the stand base, although that's matte black plastic, that's just the outer layer. It has a nice metal base plate to it as well, quite a weighty feel, so it gives a good solid footing to the monitor. You also see there's a sort of faded red coloured, slightly metallic-y looking, but it's actually plastic ring, just for a little bit of visual interest around the stand base, stand neck attachment point. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so that means there is a panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and when the screen's off as it is now, it's quite difficult to see that unless you're at the right angle. But when the screen's switched on, as you see elsewhere in the video, you will be able to see that panel border. And on the outside, you've got your slim plastic outer component to the bezel. The screen surface, that is what I like to call light to very light matte anti-glare. This is just my own classification system, nothing highly scientific about this. It just means that the glare handling is quite good, not as good as some matte screen surfaces, a bit better than others. There are certainly some lighter matte screen surfaces out there as well, ones that are sort of firmly on the very light matte area, or sort of close to glossy sometimes, or semi-glossy as some might call them. But this light to very light matte anti-glare quality, it also means that the image emitted from the monitor isn't impeded in the same way, and I explore that elsewhere in the review. I should also note that this is quite a bright room, so yes, you will see some glare, certainly as I move around, but when you're using the monitor normally, or when I'm using the monitor normally, as long as you don't have strong direct light hitting the screen surface, you won't really notice that. If you do have strong direct light hitting the screen surface, it has a sort of slightly glassy quality to it because of the light to very light matte quality. But really, if you had a stronger matte anti-glare screen surface with the same lighting conditions, you'd just get a more diffused glare patch, and that would cloud the image up as well. So it's best to avoid those kind of conditions, regardless of how effective your anti-glare surface may or may not be. At the side, you can see it's fairly slim at the thinnest point, but it bulks out centrally. There are also a few USB 3 ports, 2 USB 3.0 downstream ports. That's on the left side there, as you view the monitor from the front. You can also see the stand neck design. It sort of slopes back a bit, but it doesn't ever protrude out more than the stand base itself. So it actually has quite a compact design. The stand base is not as deep as some, and that means you can put the screen a bit closer to the wall than you can with some monitors, particularly gaming monitors. And you also see that the screen isn't all the way forward, so it sits some way back. You can see exact measurements for how far back it sits and the depth of the monitor in the written review in the features and aesthetics section there. It also offers you good ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards just a little bit. You can adjust its height, and that has a nice smooth mechanism. It's really quite a satisfyingly smooth height adjustment there. It's quite a smooth glide to it. And you can also swivel it left and right, and that was with a turntable mechanism. So that's beneath the base plate, has a turntable mechanism, so that's how that works. You can also pivot it clockwise or anti-clockwise into portrait. Exact measurements for these adjustments are given in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. At the rear, it has, again, matte black plastics used extensively, has a brushed texture to the plastic towards the top and a plainer texture further down. There's a Kensington lock slot, a K slot just there, and the OSD controls as well. So there's a little joystick and some pressable buttons, and that system is explored in the OSD video, which is a separate video. The stand attaches centrally using a quick release mechanism. So you can see there's a little switch there. If you push that up, you can easily detach the included stand from the screen. That will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. At the bottom of the stand there's a little cable tidy hook. The ports face downwards. There's a DC power input, so that means there's an external power brick sitting there under my desk in a very unloved way at the moment. There are then two HDMI 2.1 ports and DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. So these all support the full capabilities of the monitor, so you've got 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution, and you've got a 144Hz maximum refresh rate. It also supports 10-bit signal at the same time. And you do need a compatible GPU or system to use this, so you need to be either having an HDMI 2.1 port or DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. If you don't have DSC on DisplayPort, for example, one of my GPUs doesn't have this, then you're limited to 120Hz. And with it being HDMI 2.1, it also means you can use it with compatible games consoles, newer games consoles such as the Xbox Series X, which will run at the 4K UHD resolution at 120Hz. You can also, in theory, use it with the PS5. I say in theory because Acer doesn't list it as officially compatible on their own literature. And apparently it doesn't work out of the box, but you just have to go into safe mode and enable HDCP 1.4. I'll put a link to this information. There's a little article about this in the comments section. I don't have a PS5 myself, so I can't test this, and I don't know if it definitely works, but it seems that some users suggest it does work if you do that. And with HDMI 2.1, you also get VRR support, variable refresh rate support integrated into the port itself, so that doesn't rely on adaptive sync. So you can use that on the PS5. You can also use it with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on the PC, but you've also got adaptive sync via both HDMI and DisplayPort. So with the HDMI adaptive sync, you can use FreeSync, and that's FreeSync Premium in this case. Over DisplayPort, you can use that as well with a compatible AMD GPU, or with a compatible NVIDIA GPU, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. And you can also use HDR, high dynamic range, at the same time as all of this if you wish. You've then got a USB-C port, which has 65-watt power delivery, DP alt mode, and it has upstream capability. There's then a USB upstream port and two further USB 3.0 downstream ports. So the fact that you've got two upstream ports there, you can use KVM on this monitor. There's a little KVM feature in the OSD, so you can have peripherals connected to it, USB 3 peripherals, and then share them between multiple systems. Last but not always least, there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. And just something I didn't notice before, didn't mention before, the top USB port there has a little battery icon. That's because it supports fast charging for connected devices. The other one doesn't have that icon, so I can only assume it doesn't. And those are the icons there. You can see there's no battery icon there either. And that doesn't mean you can't charge things, it just means it won't charge quite as quickly if you're using those USB ports. But as I mentioned, USB-C, that has 65-watt power delivery on this model, so it's quite decent power delivery. Not as high as some models, but actually quite a few gaming monitors, they're limited to under 20 watts of power delivery. They don't even always advertise the fact they have power delivery. This one at least offers a reasonable level of power delivery. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider now, and I'm going to talk about contrast using some in-game examples. So this scene here, it's pretty typical for a scene on this game. Lots of dark elements combined with some brighter elements, and with this monitor and its IPS type panel, it does not produce a deep atmospheric look to dark scenes like this. That's just not what it's all about at all. Static contrast sits a little bit above 1000:1 using my test settings, so it's a touch stronger than some IPS type models in this respect, but a bit weaker than others. really fairly average and quite in line with my expectations and indeed the specifications for the panel. Something to be aware of as well is IPS glow. You'll be able to see that quite readily towards the top of the screen in the video, also a bit towards the bottom. If you're sitting in an ergonomically correct viewing position, you would actually have your eyes a bit above center, so you tend to see this more towards the bottom of the screen. On this model, it sort of appears as a haze, which is sort of greenish grey or slightly warm grey depending on the angle and which bit of the screen you're looking at. And this does affect the atmosphere, as you can clearly see, especially if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now. The level of IPS glow on this model, it's really quite typical for an IPS type panel, especially one of this kind of size. It's much in line with what I've seen on many monitors before. It's also something that's brought out more strongly if you're using a higher brightness, if you're sitting closer to the screen, or if your unit has some uniformity issues, some dark uniformity issues, for example backlight bleed and clouding. Mine does have some of that, especially towards the top, which is why you can see this brought out more strongly there. But even if you have one with perfect uniformity, you're still going to get IPS glow, and you're still going to have this sort of haze that emanates from the corners of the screen in particular, eats away at atmosphere and detail. A relative strength of IPS type models like this though is the strong gamma consistency. So the detail levels, aside from the regions affected by IPS glow, that does ebb away at this, but overall the detail levels are actually quite well maintained for dark content like this. My unit's gamma is actually slightly above 2.2 as well. It averages 2.3 when set up optimally, or what I consider to be optimally. Again, refer to the calibration section of the written review for more on this. But what that means is that there's actually a bit of masking of detail, but it's not extreme, which is why I just left it here, and I was quite happy to do that. Not all units would have this. The gamma calibration will be different between units, and also there are various gamma settings, so if you prefer, you can have things looking more detailed with extra detail revealed if you prefer that for a competitive edge or whatever it might be. But I like the way that it doesn't have these sort of shifts you get on VA models where you'd have a central region which is quite a bit more masked than it should be, that's black crush, and then peripherally you might have extra unintended detail. TN models are particularly bad with this actually, so towards the top you would have things looking too masked where perceived gamma's too high. Further down you'd have things looking kind of flooded, washed out, perceived gamma's far too low, and that's actually quite bad because it can give a blocky or banded appearance. And if you're looking at heavily compressed content on platforms like Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime Video, that kind of thing, this banded appearance or blockiness, which you can get on TN and certainly on some VA models as well, it can be quite annoying. And because of the strong gamma consistency of this model with this IPS type panel, you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. Unless you happen to be using a lower gamma than you should, and that will mean that it's the same throughout the screen. I've now lightened up the room quite a bit, and it's fairly bright actually, and you can see that the IPS glow isn't really something you can notice, or you shouldn't be able to notice it so readily here. You can certainly see glare on the screen. That can be exaggerated a bit on the video. It's not something that I notice so much by eye. And this also takes an edge off the contrast or the fact that the darker shades don't look particularly deep or inky because of the fairly limited static contrast, certainly when you compare them to most VA models. But you can still see some discrepancies there. If you look at the bezel there, that's pure black, and there's nothing on the monitor which is as dark as that, even in this kind of light. That kind of discrepancy is certainly not as obvious as it is in a darker room. And if you do like to sit in a mainly dark room, and I do appreciate some people do, what I'd recommend is have some light behind the monitor if you can. You can have LED strips attached to the monitor. Some people like doing that, or you can have a sort of a lamp just shining on the wall behind the monitor, just to create a bit of an aura of light around the monitor. So that will act as a bias light, and that will greatly enhance perceived contrast. That's something which is not just useful on IPS type models like this, even VA models, it can be useful as well. Back to the doom and gloom now, and I've also adjusted the camera settings. The reason for that is that I want to focus on these brighter shades and show you that there's not just a giant ball of light there. There's actually floodlights. You can see them now a bit more distinctly, a bit more as they appear to the eye. But of course the darker area there looks way darker than it does to the eye. I'm just trying to focus on these brighter shades. The reason for that is that I'd like to talk about screen surface. Very important to me. It's something I like to talk about in my reviews, and it's something which I don't think most other reviewers cover in enough detail. On this one, it's light to very light matte, as I demonstrated earlier when the monitor was switched off. And the positive effect of that means that the image doesn't have a clear layered appearance, it's not a clear layering of the screen surface in front of the image, and it doesn't impede the light emitted from the monitor as much as stronger matte screen surfaces, so it better maintains its clarity and vibrancy potential. The other aspect of screen surface to consider is the surface texture itself. In this case, these lighter shades, they do look a bit grainy. Not massively grainy though, it's not a smeary graininess, it's not a heavy graininess, and it's actually at a level which most users won't even notice, won't have a problem with at all. It's something that I'm very sensitive to. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction. To start off this section, I always like to use Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and they're tests for viewing angles. So the Lagom text, this should ideally appear a blended grey or blended throughout the screen. And in this case it does, although it does have a slight red tint to the striping. That could have just been because of the gamma setup of my unit or something else, but it's not too uncommon to see this kind of thing. The point here is that it is quite consistent. It doesn't have areas which have strong red saturation or flashes between red, orange and saturated green, as you'd see on models with weaker performance in this respect. And what this means is that this monitor has a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve, essentially what you'd expect from an IPS type panel like this. The purple block always appears quite weird on the video, the inverse of what you see to the eye, which is quite curious, but it's essentially a pinkish purple throughout the screen, quite consistent again. It doesn't really have the flashes between stronger pink and purple hues that you'd see on VA or TN models, and that would shift if you shift your head a bit on those models as well. On this one, if you shift your head enough, it will shift, but the point is if you move your head slightly, just at a sort of fairly normal viewing position, you don't see that in the same way you would on a TN or VA model. The red block, that's a good rich red throughout the screen. It doesn't have a sort of burnt appearance in some sections of the screen, as you'd see on models with weaker viewing angle performance. It looks very slightly deeper towards the edges of the screen. This is something I commonly observe, particularly on monitors with a dual-stage bezel design like this one, and many other monitors, to be honest. So it's very slightly darker. It's just a slight uniformity issue where things are just slightly pinched there. And you know, I'm stressing the word slight here because it just doesn't have the kind of shifts you'd see on TN or VA models. Good consistency here. Green block, nice consistent green throughout the screen. It's a saturated green chartreuse shade, so it's essentially a slightly yellowish green, but very consistent throughout the screen. It doesn't have areas which have much stronger yellowing than other areas, as you'd get on models with weaker performance in this respect. Blue block, as usual, a good rich, consistent royal blue throughout the screen. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So this monitor's colour gamut extends some way beyond sRGB. I measured 89% of the DCI-P3 colour space. What this means is for content like this and most content you consume, this is a game running an SDR, by the way, it's not running an HDR. This is created with the sRGB colour space in mind, so if you've got a wider gamut than that, it invites extra saturation and extra vibrancy beyond what the developers will have in mind. As I mentioned in this case, 89% DCI-P3, so there is a boost in saturation, in vibrancy, but it's not a strong or extreme boost. It doesn't have the level of extra saturation that some models would have. And if you look at the gamut, you can see the colour gamut in the written review at the start of the colour reproduction section, and I'll just quickly flash that on the screen so you know what I'm talking about. So that's the native gamut of this monitor. You might have noticed that it doesn't extend beyond sRGB in all regions, it's just for some red shades, some green shades, so it's not a truly massive gamut by any means. The effect this has on the image is not the same as you would have with a digital saturation boost, so if you increase saturation in the OSD, or you increase NVIDIA's digital vibrance control or saturation slider in your graphics driver, so what that'll do is it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So the most saturated shades with the digital saturation boost, they're not changed. It just crushes the shade variety. With the wide gamut, achieving this extra saturation, you get that shade variety. And this is particularly strong on this model as well because of that strong colour consistency I demonstrated with Lagom, so the richness is maintained throughout the screen. It also means that there are subtly different shades, for example, the golden greens and browns in the background there, which are brought out in a way which wouldn't be on monitors with weaker colour consistency. But the extra saturation is certainly there, so some of these red shades are richer than they should be. And this is a look which quite a lot of people will quite like, and especially in this case is not an extreme oversaturated look. It doesn't look cartoonish in my opinion or anything like that. And the reddish brown of this tree log here as well, again, the red hues are brought out too strongly, but it's not extreme. It doesn't have the kind of look that some monitors give. The same with the green moss there as well on the log. Sometimes yellowish greens like that, the yellow component can be brought out far too strongly on wide gamut monitors, and it can give things a kind of slightly cartoonish nuclear look, for lack of a better term. Just makes it look quite unnatural. Same with the yellowish greens of this bush here. In this case, the yellow components aren't that extreme, and there are certainly some lush looking greens, but the yellows aren't overdone in the same way. So I think that actually works quite well for lusher looking vegetation on this model. Sort of enhances it beyond sRGB without making it look unbalanced. And the red of these markers as well, that's a good solid deep red. It doesn't have this sort of orangey red or neon look which some wide gamut monitors provide as well. So overall, as I mentioned, really I think the balance that this strikes is one which many users will quite like. If you want to be using this monitor for colour critical work within extended colour spaces, it's not ideal for that because, as I mentioned, it's 89% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and I also measured 84% of the Adobe RGB colour space, so certainly a lot of coverage missing for those colour spaces. So really it would be the sRGB colour space which will be the main target you'll have in mind. Of course, if you have a colorimeter, that would be the best way to have appropriate sRGB coverage. You'd also be using color-aware applications or ICC-aware applications, so the gamut mapping would be appropriate in those cases, using the ICC profiles which ideally you've created yourself. If you don't want to use ICC profiles, you don't have your own colorimeter, anything like that, or you actually just want games like this to look more as the developers intend, the monitor also offers an sRGB emulation setting. It's found in the color section of the menu. Color space. Set that to sRGB. Now the nice thing about this is you can adjust the brightness because that's sometimes locked off with sRGB emulation settings, and that's a real annoyance, especially if it's set to a really stupid brightness, as some models do have, and that's basically makes the setting completely unusable. So you can adjust the brightness, but you'll see there's very little else you can adjust. Can't change things like the color channels or the gamma. So what this does, part of what this does, is it cuts down the color gamut, so it closely follows sRGB without the kind of overextension you'd see using the native gamut of the monitor. I'll just quickly show the gamut on the screen just for comparison. Recorded 98% sRGB coverage, and as you can see it does coincide quite closely with the sRGB gamut. Other thing is it makes various other corrections. The gamma on my unit is closely following the sRGB curve rather than 2.2, so it's slightly different. It lightens up the dark shades a bit more than you would get with 2.2, but the rest of the curve is very similar. So your medium to brighter shades look the same as they would with 2.2, and assuming everything else is the same. And my unit was also well balanced in terms of its color channels, and as I mentioned you can't change them in the OSD, but mine was well balanced in that respect. So overall the sRGB emulation setting of this one, it does work well, and it gives a more muted appearance to things. So the extra red hue brought out here and for the wood here, for example, that's removed so things look more neutral. The yellowish, I did mention that the yellow wasn't really particularly strong, but it's still toned down a bit more, so this has more of a sort of golden quality to it, more of a muted quality, more appropriate really. And if you're particularly interested in a nice visual comparison of the sRGB emulation setting and the native gamut of the monitor versus how certain shades should appear, check out the Spider Checker 24 section of the Color Reproduction section of the written review. Really nice examples of that there. But I do think that most people are going to prefer the native gamut of this monitor just because it doesn't have extreme extra saturation and people tend to like a bit of extra vibrancy, but of course everyone has their own tastes and preferences. And I'm going to talk about HDR, high dynamic range, on this monitor. And just to start this section off, I'm actually going to just be on the desktop. I've got HDR active in Windows. If you're not aware, sometimes on games you don't need to have HDR active in Windows. Sometimes games have their own toggle, and that itself is sufficient on the system side at least. But sometimes games will require this toggle, or if you're watching if you want to watch HDR movie content, you'd have to use the Windows toggle as well. You can see that things look really washed out and weird. The reason for that is that the monitor doesn't automatically switch to its HDR operating mode when it receives an HDR signal. You have to also change to the HDR preset. A few different ways to do that on this model. You can change the game mode to HDR. You can change the color space to HDR, which is in the same place as sRGB, which I showed you just before. Or you can change HDR in picture. This is my preferred way, and the reason for that is there are actually two HDR settings. So I'm going to just quickly go through the first one. And that's called Auto. This has a relatively limited peak luminance. More limited than the other setting anyway. I think it was about 340 or 344 candle hours per meter squared maximum. And the other thing is that with this setting, it just stays at that brightness throughout the screen. It doesn't have any sort of dynamic contrast element or anything like that. So if you're looking at dark content, it just looks flooded. Not appropriate in that respect. And also you'll see that brightness is grayed out, so you can't adjust that. That's quite normal in HDR actually. Contrast, various other things grayed out, so there's very little you can actually change under HDR. It's very much all automatically tuned for you. Same with colours. You can't change the colour channels or anything like that. But the other setting, it's called HDR 400. So this monitor is fully VESA DisplayHDR 400 certified. That is the lowest level which VESA will certify for. So with this setting, the peak luminance can increase to a bit above 400 candles per meter squared, I measured. And the other thing is that it uses dynamic contrast, which is enhanced by HDR metadata. Not only that, it also has local dimming, has 8 dimming zones. These are actually difficult to show you on the desktop or show you in a representative way. So I'm just going to jump into a game very shortly and just explain how that affects the experience. But it's 8 zones running across the screen. It's an edge-lit arrangement. It's not FALD or anything like that. And it's only 8 zones. So don't expect anything spectacular. But it isn't even required any local dimming at all for VESA DisplayHDR 400. So the fact it has this does lift it above some other monitors of this level. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to talk about HDR using some in-game examples. So the dimming zones, as I said, only 8 zones. So if you look at this scene here, you can see how intricate the mixture of light and dark, and this is completely typical for many scenes in games. So ideally you'd have way more dimming zones, so you'd be able to have the shadowy areas much darker than they are, slightly lighter areas a bit lighter, and much brighter areas, let's say outside there, a lot brighter. With 8 dimming zones, you don't have that precision. How they've tuned them here, they're not very aggressive, and that means that there needs to be a certain amount of brightness on the screen for the dimming zone to really light up. And I've also noticed that the change in luminance isn't generally extreme, so that means that you don't have the zones constantly sort of pulsing to different brightness levels as you're moving around in the game. The changes it makes are a bit more gentle than that. I think that works quite well actually with a limited number of dimming zones as you get here. Even if it was a completely black screen, the zones wouldn't completely dim, so they're almost shut off. They do dim though, they certainly dim a lot more than they would otherwise, and a lot more than they do with the other HDR setting, where they're just at full brightness. But that kind of makes sense because there are very few scenes in games which are just pure black screen or very dark content, and if you're going to suddenly jump into a brighter scene, then the dimming zones, if they've dimmed a lot, they then brighten up, and it can be a bit distracting visually. So I think the way they've done things is quite good in that respect, and it does give a situational boost in contrast. So here, for example, the dimming zones there, they are dimmer than they would otherwise be if the whole thing was just as bright as the dimming zones there are, if that makes sense. So they can work well there, but of course a great number of dimming zones would be preferable to this, but it's still nice to have at least some local dimming as you get here. Another aspect of HDR is that it uses a 10-bit colour signal, and this monitor does support that on the monitor side. It doesn't need to use GPU dithering or anything like that. If you're using DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC or using HDMI 2.1. I'll also mention here that I'm using DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC at the moment, and that is with in NVIDIA RTX 3090, but I've also tested this with my AMD GPU, and I've tested over HDMI as well as DisplayPort, and the experience on all of this, it's very similar. So what I'm talking about here, what I'm showing you here, it would apply on other GPUs, it would apply with other connections, it would apply with other systems as well. So yes, I'm using a PC at the moment, but you'd expect a similar experience from the monitor with an HDR capable games console as well. But the 10-bit colour reproduction, coming back to that, it gives you a better nuanced shade variety. So these dark shades there, yes, it would of course be nice if the shadow details were deeper. That would help with the definition there. There is a nice natural uplift in detail from the 10-bit colour reproduction. So there's a nuanced shade variety that just isn't there under SDR. We've got 8-bit colour in games instead. And that is nice. And it's not something which you can replicate with any kind of gamma enhancement or anything like that. It does require a greater number of closely matching shades are displayed. For brighter shades, as I will demonstrate here as I jump gleefully into this nice pool of water here. Now this particular scene here is still one of my favourites. I know I've used this for quite a while. It's one of my favourites for separating good versus not so good HDR performers. And this one I'd put somewhere in the middle here, and it doesn't have a spectacular look to the bright shades. As I mentioned, a bit above 400 candela per meter squared, so it doesn't have those brilliant pulses of luminance that some models with more powerful backlights will show under HDR. But the fact that the local dimming at least helps the predominantly darker areas look a bit dimmer in comparison, that does help with the visual contrast, so it's better than I see on quite a few other VESA DisplayHDR 400 certified monitors. But again, you will see that there's an intricate mixture of shades, lots of really dark shadow detailing and various medium shades, various ones between the very bright shades and very dark shades. So ideally you would certainly have effective local dimming in place, more effective with a greater number of dimming zones than you've got here. For these brighter shades as well, the 10-bit colour reproduction comes into play there. I'm just going to adjust the camera so this is shown in less of a ridiculous way, more representative way. Again, you won't be able to see what I see or what you'd see in person on this video. This isn't an HDR video and I have no idea of the capabilities of your monitor, etc, etc. But at least you can see that's not just a giant ball of light, and to the eye there are very smooth gradients there, really nice progressions of shades. The 10-bit colour reproduction again helping in that respect, so this helps with weather effects and other special effects, that kind of thing. And the mist above the water and the rays of light, that kind of thing. And the extra precision is helpful when it comes to putting the more generous colour gamuts that are targeted under HDR to good use. And this model, as I mentioned, 89% of the DCI-P3 colour space. The developers actually target DCI-P3 in the near term and have a longer term target of Rec 2020 in mind, which is a massive colour space. So this monitor doesn't come anywhere near covering Rec 2020 and it only offers 89% of DCI-P3. So it's not a perfect match for the HDR content, but under HDR things are still mapped well so that the more muted shades appear appropriately muted. So Lara's hair, for example, sometimes has too much of a red cast. It would do under SDR. Not extreme on this model, and that's because the colour gamut doesn't extend massively beyond sRGB, but it is noticeable. And again, some of the yellowish greens or some of the greens, they now look nice and lush, nice and deep. There are certainly shades beyond sRGB here. They don't have the yellow push that they sometimes had before. Again, that's not extreme on this model anyway, but I'm just trying to point out that natural shades look appropriately natural and muted, and some of these more vibrant shades have some decent vibrancy to them. I actually loaded up the wrong scene here. I wasn't trying to show you this, but I'm going to roll with it anyway. So with this scene here, I actually used this one when I showed the Acer XV282K quite a while ago, and that has 512 dimming zones, and that allowed the bright flames there to appear really bright, and again the backlight brightness was way higher than it is here. The darker shades nice and dark. In this case, yes, some local dimming, so it kind of helps, but really a lot of this looks quite flooded. You can see the IPS glow in full effect as well. That's because it's not super dark. It's actually, there are enough sort of bright areas, bright highlights, so the level of intricacy is just not there for these kind of scenes. I'm now on the scene I was actually trying to show you. This has a nice variety of greens, and again plenty of lush shades beyond the sRGB colour space. Some nice lush deep greens there mixed in, some lush foresty greens, and again things looking really more or less as they should. I would say though that some of these greens don't look as lush or as deep as they could, and that would require extra extension in the gamut, so they're not as brilliant as I've seen them on some monitors. The berries or the fruit here as well, the oranges, don't have the same pop they do on some monitors, but they still look vibrant, they're still quite eye-catching. And again, there are some shades there beyond the sRGB colour space. So I've definitely seen better performers in terms of colour reproduction with more generous colour gamut under HDR, but I've also seen worse. Some HDR capable monitors basically just cover sRGB and very little beyond that. So this one at least has 89% of the DCI-P3 colour space, so it gives you a bit of vibrancy for these HDR scenes, whilst the more muted shades look appropriately muted as well. So yeah, just to reinforce that really I see this as a sort of middling HDR performer, better than some VESA HDR 400 implementations because of the fact it does have some local dimming. 10-bit colour reproduction used appropriately, the colour gamut used appropriately but not particularly generous, and the luminance at the higher end is quite limited really by HDR standards. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 144Hz refresh rate, and you might be able to see my frame rate counter in the top right there. It says 144, so I'm making the most out of the monitor by running the game at 144 frames a second. With this combination, you're getting over twice as much visual information outputted every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz, and the game running at 60 frames a second. This gives you two main advantages. One of the advantages is that it greatly improves the connected feel. That's the fluidity and the precision you feel when you're interacting with your character, interacting with the game world. That's also aided by having low input lag. On this monitor I measured pretty much dot on 3 milliseconds of input lag, so that's a low level. It indicates a low signal delay, which even sensitive users should find absolutely fine. The other benefit of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. There's an article on the website exploring responsiveness and the concept of perceived blur, definitely worth checking that out if you're not familiar with this term. But there's also a summary in the written review in the responsiveness section, towards the start of the responsiveness section, explaining perceived blur and this concept. It also has pursuit photographs which capture motion in a way which reflects the perceived blur due to eye movement, as well as pixel responsiveness. So that second element, pixel responsiveness, also important. This monitor does very well in that respect. I consider it to be very strong actually in that respect. Now the reason I say very strong and stress the very is partly because, well, it was very impressive in the pursuit photographs. And when I say that, I mean that often I will talk about slight weaknesses that monitors have, powdery trailing I like to call it. Sometimes this can be extreme, sometimes it would verge on what I call smeary trailing. It tends to be VA models which will have more of that. But sometimes this can be heavy enough to really add sort of an extra layer of perceived blur, definite extra layer. Sometimes this powdery trailing is light, so it has less of an effect on perceived blur, but still can have a bit of an effect. In this case, there's really very little of it. Actually, most pixel responses are performed optimally or very close to it. I actually had this running side by side with the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QX, and I did notice that certain details, such as the texture on the rock here, it did remain a bit sharper on this Acer compared to the Gigabyte Aorus. And I don't by any stretch of the imagination consider the Gigabyte Aorus to be a slow monitor. It was running at 144Hz, by the way, just to keep things fair. It wasn't running at 240Hz. So really the Acer is impressive in that respect. And it's more impressive than I saw on the older generation 144Hz 4K UHD models, such as the Asus PG27UQ and the Acer XV282K KV. I hate these model codes. I'm sure they can create a bit of a headache for you viewers as well. But again, they had more of this powdery trailing and they had stronger overshoot as well. That's another issue. So I'm not saying this is completely free of powdery trailing. There is actually some for some transitions, but it's really very faint. So for the white text here, for example, open range, there's just a small whiff of it, and just a little bit in places, but really the pixel responses on this scene and actually just more generally are very impressive. So this scene mainly is composed of brighter to medium shades, but there are some darker shades mixed in, as I've shown. The main weakness you actually see, it's not really powdery trailing in this case, but there is a bit of overshoot, and that appears as halo trailing, which means it's brighter than the background shade and can stand out a bit for that reason. But it's actually so slight that I'm probably not going to be able to show you this on the video. You can see it a little bit on the edge of the wall there to the left, but I'm really not confident this is going to be captured on the video because it's not in your face overshoot, it's not bright, it's not something most people are going to notice when they're at these kind of high refresh rates at least. The monitor does have adjustable pixel overdrive. As it's an Acer monitor, they call it overdrive, and you'll find that in the gaming section of the OSD. If you set this to off, it's exactly the same as normal, or imperceptibly different. There might be some very slight weaknesses, but to my trained eye even, I just can't spot them, and with Pursuit photographs they didn't come out at all. And I suspect if you were to measure pixel responses, they're going to be pretty similar. So it appears essentially that the off and normal settings are very much the same. Now this could of course change with later revisions. It could be that the off setting is not supposed to act in this way. So it's possible that there'll be some changes in later revisions of this monitor, perfectly possible. So just because my unit behaves like this, don't assume they all will in the future, but they might do. I can't say either way. But this extreme setting, this is when you'll really notice the overshoot. Extreme overshoot. As I already mentioned, I find normal very well tuned, really very strong in terms of its pixel responsiveness. So I don't know why you'd want to put up with this ridiculous amount of overshoot. You can see inky trailing behind there, so it's not just halo trailing, it actually has an inky and colourful appearance as well. So it's not just brighter. There is some halo trailing which is brighter. It's a nice example here. Kind of colourful, very bright. Hopefully will come across on the video, but can't always promise that. So really the extreme setting is pretty useless. If you're using adaptive sync, so you've got AMD FreeSync Premium enabled on the monitor, I believe it's actually referred to as adaptive sync if you're using HDMI. It's exactly the same thing. It does actually use FreeSync Premium over HDMI if you have an AMD GPU, so I don't know why they've changed the naming there, but that's just what they've done. Anyway, it's called AMD FreeSync Premium if you're using DisplayPort, works in the same way on NVIDIA GPUs, and I'll come on to that shortly. But if you enable this, it just acts as if you've set things to normal. So again, you get that nice strong performance, good balance, but you'll see the overdrive setting is grayed out. Just as a side note, if you're using HDMI 2.1 VRR, then it doesn't grey the overdrive out. It's just if you have this AMD FreeSync Premium, or what might be called adaptive sync depending on the connection you're using. If you've got that enabled, that's what will grey the overdrive out. It doesn't really matter either way though, because at least on my unit, normal and off are essentially the same thing. So there's no need to change it, and the extreme setting is just unusable. Now, whilst I say that I don't find this overshoot in your face or obvious, it's worth pointing out that sensitivity to overshoot does vary, so some people are more sensitive to this than others, and I know some people don't like to have this overshoot, so it would have been nice to have a lower setting, which would get rid of this for the people that just don't like to see that, but that isn't an option in this case. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5. The pixel responses again here, very good, and that's really nice to see because there are lots of darker shades involved in the transitions here, and they can show stronger weaknesses. So with the models I pointed out before, the Gigabyte Aorus and also the older 144Hz 4K UHD models, they do have some more pronounced weaknesses here. With this model, there's really nothing to complain about in the way of powdery trailing. Very faint powdery trailing in places, for example behind the makeshift roof, but I do stress the very faint in this case, and the same up here. But actually, it's mainly the overshoot again which you see. So this does have quite aggressive pixel overdrive, but it's not extreme overshoot at these nice high refresh rates at least. So there's really not a lot more to say about that. Impressively strong performance overall. The flag there shows a bit of this overshoot. I'm not sure if that'll come across on the video because again it's not extreme, it's not super bright. It's just a little bit brighter in the background so it can stand out. Bit of halo trailing. You might have noticed I was moving the mouse around with this light. That's because sometimes monitors will show dirty trailing, another form of overshoot, which is darker than the background colour and can stand out as a sort of inky look to the trailing. In this case, there's a very small amount of that around the light, but it really wouldn't catch the eye if you're just playing the game normally, as most of this overshoot wouldn't. I've ramped up the graphics settings, and I'm going to talk about adaptive sync now. Now, the reason I've ramped up the graphics settings is just so you can see that my frame rate is dipping below 144 frames a second. And if you have adaptive sync or using VRR, I've already mentioned these terms before, but just to give you a reminder, this monitor supports adaptive sync. That means you can use AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems. You can do that via HDMI and also via DisplayPort. Or as an NVIDIA user, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. You can only use that with adaptive sync over DisplayPort. Confusingly enough, there's also HDMI 2.1 VRR that doesn't use adaptive sync, but it is the same kind of thing. It's a variable refresh rate technology. And you can use that with systems such as the PS5, which doesn't actually support adaptive sync. You can also use it with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Whether you're using AMD FreeSync Premium, whether you're using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode with VRR on HDMI or via DisplayPort with adaptive sync, the experience is very similar. I tested my RTX 3090 with both of these, also tested my AMD Radeon RX 580 using AMD FreeSync Premium, and the experience was very much the same. So it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches, and that's because the monitor is dynamically adjusting its refresh rate to match the frame rate of the content. There's also refresh rate refresh rate number in the OSD, and if you enable that and you're in the VRR environment, it will reflect the frame rate of the content, so you can see that's fluctuating along with the frame rate. They don't always match exactly because the polling rate is slightly different between the two, but you can definitely see that's not just sticking to 144. And on this model, the variable refresh rate window, the main variable refresh rate window for the hardware operation, that goes down to 48 Hz. So that means if your game is running between 48 frames a second and 144 frames a second, it's within the VRR window, it just does its thing, with the refresh rate matching the frame rate. If the frame rate drops below 48, then it uses LFC, or what AMD refers to as LFC, low frame rate compensation. That means that the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So for example, if it dropped to 30 frames a second, the monitor can't go to 30 Hz, that isn't supported. And that gets rid of tearing and stuttering all the same. And that's a really nice bonus. I should mention that sensitivity to tearing and stuttering does vary, so not everyone will find this as dramatic as other people. Some people will be quite happy to actually just leave the technology disabled, and that's fine. But for some people like me who are sensitive to tearing and stuttering, it's really nice to have this, a really nice bonus. I've increased my graphics settings just a bit, so you can see the frame rate is around 100 to 110 frames a second, a little bit of fluctuation either side. But the reason I've done this is because I do want to talk about overshoot. That is something which unfortunately becomes stronger on this model. It doesn't support variable overdrive. So what variable overdrive is, it's a standard feature and a very well implemented feature on models that have a G-Sync module. So that means full fat G-Sync if you prefer. And that means that the pixel overdrive is always retuned as the refresh rate drops to counteract this overshoot. Because you don't need such a high level of acceleration at lower refresh rates. Your pixel response requirements are lower, the sensitivity to the voltage regulation is different as the refresh rate changes, so it's better to account for this with proper adjustments, but without variable overdrive you don't have that. And as I've said, you can't adjust the overdrive setting with adaptive sync enabled, and even if you do this with VRR, HDMI 2.1 VRR, the offsetting is just the same as normal here. You're going to get this stronger overshoot. You can see that as halo trailing, hopefully it'll come across on the video, around the tree there, around the flag. At this point, I still wouldn't say it's extreme. So I think that as long as you're sort of in these triple digits and you're not too sensitive to overshoot, you're probably going to quite enjoy the experience that this monitor provides with the variable refresh rate. I've bumped up the graphics settings further so that things have dropped closer to around 80 frames a second. And at this point, the overshoot is quite a feature, quite bright, quite noticeable halo trailing. This will almost certainly come across on the video, especially around the flag there. So this is quite eye-catching. And again, some people actually won't notice this or won't be bothered by it, but I've used a lot of monitors, and for me, I do consider this to be quite on the strong side in terms of overshoot. Not extreme, but quite strong still. And yet another increase, it's actually crossing the boundary sometimes. I should mention that although I said it's a 48 Hz, 48 frames a second boundary, it sometimes crosses it a little bit above that. It's not always a strict thing, so you might notice that sometimes it seems to cross the LFC boundary at sort of 50, 51 Hz. Sometimes it does it lower. It's not a precise thing. It kind of depends on what the frame rate has come from. It sort of tries to control it in that way. It's not always precise exactly at 48 Hz, but either way, don't worry about that. Point is, at this level, it's about as low as the refresh rate will go, and that overshoot is very noticeable. You can see it as a displacement behind the object. But I should mention that all of these refresh rates I've shown you, there isn't any additional issues with powdery trailing or anything like that. The pixel responses are very rapid throughout the range, and of course the acceleration is kind of too strong, especially in these double digits, which is why you get this quite noticeable overshoot. And it would be nice to have an option to reduce that with the offsetting. Ideally, it would use variable overdrive, so you'd just have one setting, set and forget. But unfortunately, overshoot is just something you have to put up with on this model if you're using VRR and your frame rate dips. If you're not using variable refresh rate, then the monitor will just stick to whatever you set it at, say 144 Hz, and the pixel overdrive just behaves exactly in the same way as it does at 144 Hz, so you don't get this strong overshoot, but instead you'd get tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. And just another thing to note is, when it crosses the LFC boundary, you can see the refresh rate suddenly jump up there. That's because it's crossing the boundary. There is a momentary stuttering, a slight stuttering, and that's completely normal for LFC. In fact, I think this happens on every single monitor. You might not necessarily notice it, it's not an extreme stuttering, but if you're frequently passing this boundary, then that could be annoying. It's just another form of stuttering, and you might notice it. But for most people, you're only going to be occasionally passing this boundary, so you shouldn't really have an issue with this. The monitor also includes a strobe backlight setting called VRB, Visual Response Boost. You can't use that at the same time as adaptive sync, and it definitely has some issues attached to it. If you're familiar with strobe backlight settings, then I'll give you a quick rundown here, but I'm not going to show you it because all you see in the video is obnoxious flickering. You can't see the benefits of this setting at all. It does reduce the perceived blur due to eye movement. That's exactly what it's supposed to do, but it also has some strobe crosstalk. There's flickering because that's how strobe backlights work. It strobes the backlight at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display. You can set it to either 120 or 144 Hz, so you can't escape that flickering. The brightness regulation is different. There are only certain brightnesses you'd actually be able to set it to, and there are some colourful flashes which you can notice because of the KSF phosphors used. But if you're interested in the strobe backlight setting anyway, it is explored in the written review, various different sections, including the responsiveness section. We'll give you the lowdown on that setting. To wrap up then, the overall design of the monitor, it's not in-your-face gamery, so I think most people will find it quite acceptable. The only colourful element is that sort of faded red coloured ring around the stand base, stand neck attachment point. The stand base is nice and weighty as well, although I would have quite liked to have seen powder coated metal on the outer surface as well. The stand neck has powder coated metal, so that has a nice premium feel to it. It also has a satisfyingly smooth gliding mechanism for the height adjustment. The monitor also offers tilt, swivel and pivot adjustments, so excellent ergonomics from the monitor. The 28-inch screen and the 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution, I liked this combination, worked well, really nice pixel density. Yes, some users will have to rely on scaling, but that's handled well in modern versions of Windows and most programs as well. And as such, you still benefit from that strong clarity from the pixel density. You also benefit from that for suitably high resolution image content, games and movies. I also liked that the monitor is Eyesafe certified. I think every little helps when it comes to viewing comfort. There are many different factors to consider, but I certainly see lower energetic blue light output from the monitor as a good box to tick. The sensor suite as well, you can see that blinking away. You've probably seen that in various points of the review. That's just infrared, by the way. You can't see it to the eye, although it can be a bit bothersome in the video, so don't worry, you don't see it in person. But the sensor suite functionality, I liked the proxy sense feature. I found that quite useful. That just dims the screen or turns it off if you step away from your desk. The colour sense feature as well, I found that quite useful as essentially a low blue light setting in the evenings. The light sense feature, not too keen on that, but I'm not usually very keen on light sensor features that don't give you proper flexibility because everyone has their own preferences for brightness. In terms of contrast performance, largely in line with my expectations for the panel, moderate amount of IPS glow, quite a normal amount of IPS glow, around 1000:1 static contrast, a bit higher depending on the settings you use, so it doesn't give you a deep and atmospheric experience by any stretch of the imagination. The light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface helped to preserve the vibrancy and clarity better than stronger matte screen surfaces. The finish to the screen surface wasn't the smoothest I've seen, so it did have a bit of a grainy look to lighter content, but it wasn't too bad. It wasn't the kind of thing which most users will really notice or be bothered by. In terms of colour reproduction, the monitor provided a colour gamut of 89% DCI-P3, so it doesn't have the kind of extension that some wide gamut monitors have beyond sRGB. And that can be actually a good or bad thing depending on your perspective. Good because the extra saturation isn't extreme for the sRGB content, isn't as extreme as it could be, but it is there. And it also means that the vibrancy potential isn't as strong as it could be with an even wider gamut. But I think the overall balance of things here, it'll be something which will appeal to many people actually, because I know some people do like a hint of extra vibrancy without the sort of really strong oversaturation. Everyone has their own opinion about that, their own preferences. The colour consistency was also very strong. The monitor also provides an effective sRGB emulation setting that was very well calibrated on my unit, and it also allows you to adjust brightness, so that was really good to see. The monitor is also VESA DisplayHDR 400 certified. The HDR on the monitor, it was middling overall, but better than quite a few VESA HDR 400 implementations. So the peak luminance wasn't particularly high. It was a little bit above 400 candles per meter squared, which is all that's required at that level of HDR. But it also employed 8-zone local dimming. It wasn't a particularly aggressive dimming algorithm either. So that meant that it gave a situational edge in contrast, and it did work, did what it should do, but it didn't make extreme adjustments, so it wasn't as distracting as it could have been if these dimming zones, which are rather large, were constantly adjusting their brightness by a huge amount. 10-bit colour reproduction, enhancing the nuanced shade variety for HDR as well, and the colour gamut being 89% of the DCI-P3 colour space, not as generous as it could have been, and not as generous as some HDR models, but better than others. In terms of responsiveness, I was very impressed by the 144Hz performance of the monitor. Very rapid pixel responses with really very little to complain about in the way of conventional trailing. A bit of overshoot, but nothing that I consider overbearing at these high refresh rates. Low input lag as well, good low signal delay, no complaints there. Adaptive sync works as it should as well. And also HDMI 2.1 VRR, and the fact it had HDMI 2.1, that's really a key selling point of this monitor as well. For PC users, it's really neither here nor there, although you can use it with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode if you wish, but it is important for games consoles which will use HDMI rather than DisplayPort, and it allows you to get a 120Hz 4K UHD signal. Although as I mentioned in the review, I'm not entirely clear on if that will work with the PS5 correctly, because Acer doesn't sort of officially list it as compatible there, and I think some people have had some issues, but it seems that it can be cleared up if you enter safe mode on the PS5 and turn HDCP to 1.4, but I don't have a PS5, so that's not something I can test myself. Where I was less impressed with the responsiveness was when it came to the handling of the pixel overdrive for lower refresh rates, and that would include lower frame rates if you're using VRR, and that's because there was no setting available which would reduce the aggressiveness of the greater gray acceleration, which, as I said, works very well for the higher refresh rate, but certainly when you're in the double digits, you then get strong overshoot, and there's no way to tame that. The offsetting, which is available if you're using HDMI 2.1 VRR at least, that's exactly the same as normal, or certainly was on my unit. This is something that Acer could perhaps tweak in the future, but I can't promise they will do, so that's something you'd have to keep an eye on if you're interested in the lower refresh rate performance of this monitor as well. But that really is sort of the key divider, in my opinion, for this monitor. I really enjoyed the experience with my RTX 3090, but that's because it was very easy for me to maintain triple-digit frame rates with nice graphics settings. And I know I'm very lucky to have an RTX 3090, not everyone has that luxury. It's actually difficult to get pretty much any graphics card at the moment, a really horrible market for that kind of thing. So if you're one of the chosen ones and you do have a powerful GPU, or you know that you can maintain good high frame rates, I think this monitor does deliver a very nice experience. If on the other hand you're going to be finding yourself spending more time in the double digits, it's not like there's an exact cut-off point, it's just a broad way of looking at things, then I think you would be less impressed, particularly if you're sensitive to overshoot. And it is worth mentioning that some people aren't as sensitive to overshoot as others, and there is an option to disable VRR, not use VRR, and just have the monitor running at a static 144Hz instead. So that's really all there is to the Acer XV282K KV. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.